March 15, 1943, 2:47 p.m., Tokyo. Dr. Yoshio Nishina stood in front of a blackboard covered in equations. His hands were stained with chalk dust. His eyes burned from lack of sleep. He had just solved another theoretical problem with uranium enrichment, but the solution required resources that simply didn't exist in wartime Japan. He didn't know it yet, but at that exact moment, 6,000 miles away in Tennessee, 75,000 American workers were building a secret city that would make his calculations obsolete. This is the story of the NIGO project, Japan's atomic bomb program, a race they entered with confidence, pursued with dedication, and lost before they even understood they were competing. Most people know about the Manhattan Project, fewer know about Nazi Germany's nuclear ambitions, but almost nobody knows that Imperial Japan had its own secret atomic bomb program, running parallel to both. Code-named NIGO, after the first syllable of Nishina's name, it began with a simple question asked by a military officer who understood physics better than most generals, and it ended in atomic fire over Hiroshima. The question is not whether Japan tried to build the bomb. They did. The question is why they failed so catastrophically while America succeeded so completely. The answer reveals something profound about the nature of modern warfare, industrial capacity, and the deadly cost of miscalculation. Let me take you back to where it started. April 1940. Tokyo. 18 months before Pearl Harbor, Lieutenant General Yasuda Takao sat in his office at the Army's Aviation Technology Research Institute, reading a scientific journal from America. The article described nuclear fission, the splitting of uranium atoms, and the tremendous energy released in the process. Yasuda wasn't a physicist, but he understood enough to grasp the implications. If you could create a sustained chain reaction, splitting millions of atoms simultaneously, you could build a weapon of unimaginable power. He called for one of his staff officers, Lieutenant Colonel Suzuki Tatsusaburo, a methodical man with an engineering background. Yasuda gave him a simple assignment: investigate whether building an atomic bomb from uranium was feasible. Report back in 6 months. Suzuki took the assignment seriously. He consulted with physicists, read every scientific paper he could access, did the calculations himself to verify the theoretical basis. In October 1940, he submitted his report. The conclusion was clear and unsettling. Yes, a uranium bomb was feasible. Yes, Japan should start a project immediately. And yes, the United States was probably doing the same thing. General Yasuda circulated the report among the top echelon of the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy. The Navy dismissed it. Too speculative, too expensive, too risky. But the Army was interested. In the spring of 1941, they allocated funding and assigned the project to Japan's premier research center, the Institute of Physical and Chemical Research in Tokyo, known as the RIKEN. The man chosen to lead the project was Dr. Yoshio Nishina, Japan's leading nuclear physicist, a man who had studied under Niels Bohr in Copenhagen, who understood quantum mechanics as well as anyone in the world, who had personally contributed to the foundation of atomic theory. If anyone in Japan could build an atomic bomb, it was Nishina. The project was classified at the highest level, code-named NIGO. Only a handful of people knew it existed. The budget was set at roughly $500,000 for the entire program. In comparison, the Manhattan Project would eventually spend $2 billion, but nobody in Japan knew that yet. Here's where the story gets interesting. Because Nishina wasn't starting from ignorance. Japanese scientists had made genuine contributions to nuclear physics throughout the 1930s. They understood the theory perfectly. They knew exactly what needed to be done. Obtain uranium, enrich the uranium-235 isotope to sufficient concentration, build a weapon that could sustain a chain reaction. The physics was clear. What they didn't understand was the industrial challenge, and that misunderstanding would prove fatal. For the first year, the Nishina project was essentially a two-man operation. Nishina and his colleague, physicist Takuchi Masa. They drew up plans, did calculations, determined they would need approximately 10 kilograms of uranium enriched to just 10% U-235 concentration. This was a severe underestimation. The Hiroshima bomb would eventually contain 64 kilograms enriched to 80%, but Nishina didn't know that. Nobody did. The theory was still developing. By the fall of 1942, Nishina began building a larger team. He recruited recent university graduates who had been drafted into the army. Most held the rank of lieutenant. Young men with physics degrees who suddenly found themselves working on the most secret project in Japan. At its peak in 1944, the team numbered about 20 people. 20 people trying to solve a problem that would eventually employ 130,000 workers in America. They were allocated a building on the RIKEN campus in northern Tokyo. Building 49, a 2-story wooden structure, former dining hall, 5 rooms per floor, total space about 3,500 square feet. This was Japan's Manhattan Project, a wooden building in Tokyo with 20 scientists and a budget that wouldn't have paid for 1 month of American operations. But Nishina was optimistic. He had a plan. They would pursue thermal diffusion for uranium enrichment, a theoretically sound method where uranium hexafluoride gas, when exposed to different temperatures, would allow lighter U-235 atoms to separate from heavier U-238 atoms. It would work. It had to work. The physics said so. The chemistry team, led by Kigoshi Kunihiko, worked on the second floor. Their job was to convert uranium into uranium hexafluoride, the substance needed for enrichment. This proved harder than expected. Uranium hexafluoride was extremely corrosive. It attacked every container they used. Month after month of trial and error, broken equipment, failed experiments. By mid-1944 they finally succeeded in producing stable uranium hex in usable quantities. Downstairs, Taikuchi Masa and his team were building the separator itself, a 16-foot-tall device that looked like a water heater standing on end. 2 copper pipes, one inside the other, with a 2 mm gap between them. Precision was critical. The gap had to be exactly 2 mm for the entire length. Any deviation would disrupt the thermal convection necessary for separation. But obtaining materials in wartime Japan was nearly impossible. The army allocated bent copper pipes. Taikuchi had to straighten them by hand. The tolerances were never quite right. The seals leaked. The temperature controls malfunctioned. But they persisted, month after month, making adjustments, testing, failing, trying again. Think about what was happening at this moment in the broader context of the war. It's 1944. Japan is losing, island by island, ship by ship, city by city. American B-29s are beginning their systematic destruction of Japanese urban centers. Resources are scarce. Factories are being bombed. Supply lines are cut. And in a wooden building in Tokyo, 20 men are trying to solve one of the most complex industrial challenges in human history, with equipment they're improvising from scrap. The contrast with America is staggering. While Taikuchi struggled to straighten copper pipes, the Americans were building an 825-acre facility in Tennessee with 1,152 massive calatrons for electromagnetic separation. While Nishina begged for resources, the Manhattan Project was borrowing 14,700 tons of silver from the U.S. Treasury to wind electromagnetic coils. While 20 Japanese scientists crowded into Building 49, America had built entire secret cities: Oak Ridge with 75,000 workers, Hanford with 50,000, Los Alamos with the world's greatest physicists. But Nishina didn't know any of this. He assumed American scientists faced the same constraints he faced: limited resources, wartime scarcity, competing priorities. He calculated that even America, with all its industrial might, would need years to build an atomic bomb, perhaps decades. The physics was just too difficult, the enrichment process too slow. No nation could overcome these barriers during wartime. He was catastrophically wrong. Meanwhile, in Kyoto, something interesting was developing. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which had dismissed the atomic bomb idea in 1940, suddenly changed its mind in 1943. By this point, the Navy had lost almost its entire fleet. Desperate for something, anything, to turn the tide of war, they started their own atomic bomb project, codenamed F-GO, the F standing for fission. Based at Kyoto Imperial University, under Professor Arakatsu Bonsaku, the F-GO project pursued a different approach. Instead of thermal diffusion, they planned to use ultracentrifuges, spinning at 2,500 revolutions per second, to separate uranium isotopes by centrifugal force. It was theoretically elegant. It was also completely impractical. The centrifuge design was completed in July 1945, but the machine itself was never built. F-GO never got beyond the theoretical stage. So now Japan had 2 atomic bomb projects, neither aware of the other, both pursuing different methods, both starving for resources, both convinced they had years to work. The irony would soon become apparent. Back in Tokyo, July 1944, the separator was finally complete. Taikuchi's team began feeding Kigoshi's uranium hexafluoride into the system. They heated the inner pipe to 400 degrees Celsius, cooled the outer pipe to 50 degrees, watched the gas circulate through the narrow gap, waited, hoped. For 4 months nothing happened. No enrichment, no separation, just uranium hexafluoride gas moving through copper pipes. Then, in November 1944, something changed. Tiny crystals began forming in the upper collection chamber. The team was ecstatic. They carefully extracted the samples, sent them to the analysis team. Everyone gathered around Nishina's cyclotron to test the enrichment level. The results came back. No enrichment. 0. After 3 years of work, they were exactly where they started. The Nishino team was devastated, but Nishina remained determined. They would adjust the design, refine the process, try again. They had time. America couldn't possibly have solved this problem either. The physics was universal. What was impossible in Japan was impossible in America, but time was running out faster than anyone realized. American B-29s were now hitting Tokyo regularly. Massive firebombing raids, hundreds of bombers at a time. The city was burning. The Riken campus had been lucky so far, but luck doesn't last forever. April 13, 1945, 11:23 p.m. A formation of B-29s appeared over Tokyo. Air raid sirens wailed. The Riken campus, which had survived previous raids, was finally hit. Incendiary bombs rained down. Building 49 was damaged, but initially survived. The team managed to save critical equipment. They thought they had been spared the worst. The next morning, smoldering embers that hadn't been fully extinguished reignited. Building 49 caught fire again. This time, there was nothing they could do. Dr. Nishina and his exhausted colleagues stood watching as their entire program, their 3 years of work, their separator, their equipment, their calculations, burned to the ground. But Nishina found an odd comfort in the disaster. At least now they knew for certain that building an atomic bomb would take years, maybe decades. No nation could do it during wartime, not Japan, not America. The industrial requirements were simply too massive, the physics too unforgiving. Even the Americans, with all their resources, couldn't possibly have succeeded. They were wrong. Catastrophically, fatally, wrong. 3 months later, August 6, 1945, 8:15 a.m. and 17 seconds. Little Boy, a uranium-235 gun-type fission device, detonated 1,968 feet above Hiroshima. The fireball reached 18 million degrees Fahrenheit in 1/millionth of a second. The blast wave traveled outward at 984 miles per hour. In the first second, 80,000 people died instantly. The mushroom cloud rose to 40,000 feet within minutes. In Tokyo, Nishina knew nothing yet. Communication systems were primitive. The first reports were confused. Hiroshima's radio station went dead mid-broadcast at 8:16 a.m. Initial reports suggested a massive bombing raid, but something was strange. There had only been 3 aircraft. B-29 raids typically involved hundreds of bombers. By noon, fragmentary reports reached Tokyo. Survivors described a single enormous explosion, a flash brighter than the sun, a giant cloud rising into the stratosphere, buildings vaporized, people reduced to shadows burned into stone walls. Nishina heard these reports with growing horror. He understood immediately what others did not. The descriptions matched theoretical predictions for an atomic explosion, but his mind resisted. It was impossible. America couldn't have built a bomb. His calculations proved it. The Imperial Japanese Army dispatched investigation teams, including several of Nishina's colleagues. They carried Geiger counters and radiation detection equipment. By August 7, they reached Hiroshima. What they found was unmistakable. The radiation readings confirmed it. This had been an atomic explosion. The scale of destruction went beyond their predictions. Their models hadn't fully accounted for the thermal radiation, the firestorms, the radiation poisoning already killing thousands. They collected samples of fused sand and metal, glass created by temperatures over 3,000 degrees Celsius. Spectroscopic analysis confirmed uranium-235. The Americans had solved the enrichment problem. When the report reached Nishina August 8, he finally understood the magnitude of their miscalculation. The amount of enriched uranium in Little Boy represented industrial capacity at least 1,000 times larger than Japan's entire program. 1,000 times. While he had been scraping together equipment, begging for resources, working in a wooden building with 20 people, America had built facilities on a scale Japan couldn't begin to match. But the implications were even worse. If America had this much capacity, they didn't just have one bomb, they had more. They could produce them on a schedule. Japan had no defense against weapons that vaporized cities in seconds. On August 9, as the Supreme Council debated Japan's next move, Fat Man detonated over Nagasaki at 11:02 a.m., the second bomb in 3 days. This one wasn't even uranium, it was plutonium. The Americans had pursued multiple paths simultaneously. While Japan struggled with one approach, America had built both uranium enrichment facilities and plutonium production reactors. The scale of the Manhattan Project became clear over the following weeks. $2 billion, 130,000 workers, multiple secret sites, dozens of Nobel Prize winners, redundant systems, parallel research paths. When one method proved too slow, they built facilities for multiple methods simultaneously. When copper became scarce, they borrowed silver from the treasury. They had approached the atomic bomb not as a scientific challenge, but as an engineering problem to be solved through massive resource application. Japan's NIGO program had employed fewer than 20 people full-time. Their total budget wouldn't have paid for 1 month of Manhattan Project operations. The knowledge gap hadn't been the problem. Nishina understood atomic theory as well as Oppenheimer. The industrial gap had been insurmountable. After the surrender, American scientists visited Nishina's laboratory. They examined his thermal diffusion columns, his primitive cyclotron. They were respectful, professional courtesy between colleagues, but Nishina could see the pity in their eyes. His entire program was smaller than a single building at Oak Ridge. One American scientist, attempting kindness, mentioned that Nishina's thermal diffusion approach was theoretically sound. The Americans had actually used thermal diffusion as one of their enrichment methods. Nishina's science had been correct, he simply hadn't had the resources to scale it up. Cold comfort. In war, correct theory without industrial capacity means nothing. Dr. Yoshio Nishina died in 1951, 6 years after Hiroshima. He spent those final years reflecting on the miscalculation that had defined his program. He had assumed American scientists would face the same constraints he faced. He had projected his own limitations onto his adversaries. He hadn't understood that America's industrial economy, even while fighting a two-ocean war, had spare capacity that exceeded Japan's entire pre-war industrial base. The NIGO project failed not because Japanese scientists lacked knowledge or dedication. It failed because modern warfare had evolved beyond what Japan could comprehend. The atomic bomb was a scientific achievement, yes, but more importantly, it was a demonstration of industrial capacity so overwhelming that no other nation on Earth could match it in 1945. In the end, the lesson of the NIGO project is simple and brutal. In modern warfare, resources triumph over theory. Organization trumps elegance. Industrial capacity matters more than scientific knowledge. Japan's physicists understood the atom as well as anyone. But understanding wasn't enough. Building was everything. And America didn't just understand the bomb, they built it, at a scale that made comparison meaningless.